Hello and welcome to Bicep for Real episode 5. This week we're going to continue the work we did last week on getting set up with the container part of our application. And this week we're actually going to deploy the containers into the environment we created last week. So we're still working on our Lambda Toys digital store project. We're going to look at taking the container that the developer's been building and how we're going to deploy that into our container environment. So if you remember, this is the state of our environment from last week, or at least the design of the environment from last week. And we've got now the container apps running in the middle there. We've added a few extra pieces on for Key Vault and Container Registry. And during the week, our developers have gone on and pushed the first version of the container image into our container registry. So that's ready to go. And so now we're going to look at how do we actually deploy that container into our container environment and hook all that up. Okay, so we're over in Visual Studio Code. Before we start on the container piece, just one bit to update you on. If you remember last time when we deployed the core infrastructure, we created this orders table in the container in the CosmosDB. We actually going to need another table or a container, whatever you want to call it, for our Dapper state. So we're not going to go into great detail on how Dapper works in these modules, but one of the components of Dapper allows you to have a state management storage. In particular, we're going to use Cosmos for that, and that needs a container with a specific partition key. In fact, this one down here, which actually needs to be the word partition key. So I've just added that into our core infrastructure to add another container, so we'll end up with two containers, and I've deployed that, so our Cosmos DB container is up and running for that, just to make you aware. Okay, so if we go back to our ACA Bicep module. You remember from last week we deployed this cube environment, and that's all set up and running. And so what we're going to do now is add in the container piece. Before we do that, we need to add some extra parameters into this module. As I mentioned last week, at the minute these are two separate modules. We are going to have to pass in some data from the core module into this module to do our work. For the minute, we are just going to put that into the config file. Next week, we're actually going to have a look at bringing that all together. So we run them from a top level file that passes the values in between each of them. So we'll get to that to make it a bit easier to run the whole thing end to end. But for now, while we're debugging and building out, we'll keep it fairly simple. So we need a few more parameters. Firstly, we need some information about the container registry that we are going to grab the image from. So we need the container registry name. We also need to spell parameters, right? We need the container registry username. And we also need the container registry password. So if you remember from last week, we deployed the container registry. And because ACA doesn't yet support managed identity, we needed some credentials to access that. And so we took that admin username and password, or the password, sorry, and put that into Key Vault. And so we're going to use that here. Now, because it's a password, we don't want to use a string, we want to use a secure string. And if we actually select that, what it will do is convert that into the newer annotation-based Bicep setup, which basically adds this secure label on top and then converts it into a string. So that's what we want for that. We also need a few more. I'm going to paste those in. So we need a container version, which is the version of the container we're going to use. We know every time developers release a new version, we're going to get a new version number. And then we need some information about the CosmosDB, the account, the database, and the container. Now, this information eventually is going to come from the other module. But for now, we're just putting that straight in here. Okay. So what we're also going to need is the key from the CosmosDB database. Now we could pass that in as a parameter, but what I want to show you here is the way to actually grab information from an existing resource. So we know the CosmosDB account name, and so what we can do is we can create a new resource of CosmosDB type. So we'll just grab that. That says same as we did in the other document, CosmosDB account of this type, but we'll add in the existing keyword. So the existing basically says this isn't a new object, this is an existing one. I want you to go and grab the reference to. And this just needs the name. And so we've already got that here. So this will go and grab that account that already exists and make it available in our project. So we can then create a variable. So we're going to call this the CosmosDB key. And that's going to be pulled from this CosmosDB account. So if we go in here and we want to list keys, and then we want the primary master key, and that's going to go and get that. So it allows us basically to create a reference to that existing resource, and we can then go and get details from that. That resource doesn't have to be created by Bicep. We did create it in the previous one, but this could be something that's done manually or another area of your subscription that somebody else has done. You don't need to do that. You just need to have the details. Now, this here assumes that the Cosmos account is in the same resource group as we're deploying to, which it is. If it's not, there is also a scope property here, which you can use to set that scope, but we don't need that. So we've got our key now. Right, so next we need to deploy the container, and there's quite a few parts to this. So this is the Microsoft Web Container Apps here. As I mentioned, this is going to change. This is going to come Microsoft.app, but it's not yet. And we are now going to go and start deploying that. And we've got a few standard things. So we've got our name, which we're going to again use our prefix for. Stick that there. We need the location, which is going to use the location variable that we passed in, the parameter. The kind is going to be container app, all lowercase. And then we need our properties section. And this is where all the interesting information goes. So first up, we need the kube environment ID. This is the environment that we deployed last time, this bit up here. So we can just do env.id. We need the configuration. And there's a few things we are going to need in here. So first up, we need some secrets. So if you're familiar with Kubernetes or container-based things, a secret is a resource you can deploy which basically contains passwords or whatever values you want. We need a secret here, not for our application, but for the container registry. So as I mentioned before, ACA doesn't support user managed identity, so we've got to use those credentials we created on the registry. And we can store the password in a secret, and the secrets are set up using this section. So we're just it's an array, and we're going to put one value in here, and it has a name property, which we can just call it whatever we want. So we're going to call that password, and then the value is going to be that password parameter they passed in. And that's the only secret we need at the moment. So we'll move on. And next we're going to do registries. So this is telling it the container registries it should set up. And again, we only need one for this part. And first up, it needs the server name. So this is going to be the actual name of the registry. Now we've got that in a variable. But actually, that's not going to be enough because that's just the name. This can be used to reference any container registry, not just Azure ones. It could be used Docker Hub or Key or any of those sort of things. So we need the full name included in the URL. So actually, if we stick that into a string replacement, we need to add the .azurecr.io bit to the end of it. The username we've got in a parameter, and then the password is a reference to a secret, and that's going to be this secret here, and we just put the name in, and that will reference that and grab the password from there. Next up, we've got the Ingress section, and this determines how the application is actually exposed to the outside world or not. Now, eventually, we're going to put this behind APIM, and so we won't want it to be external. But for the minute, while we're debugging, we are going to make it external. So we'll set it to true. And then we need to set the target port. This is the port on the container that we're going to expose to the outside world. So I believe it's running on 80. I'll check in a minute, but I think that's what it's running on. Then outside of the configuration, we've got another section, which is the template. This is basically what to deploy and how to deploy it. And a few different sections here. We'll start with containers. This tells it which containers you want to deploy, and that should be an array. And again, you can have multiple containers within an app. Generally, you don't. It's only where they've got a very tightly coupled life cycle. We're only going to have one. And so what we need in here, first up, is the image. So this is the name of the image that we're going to deploy, and this has got a few different components. So first up, it starts with a container registry name, including the full URL. Then the actual name of the container image itself, which is this. We're using a demo app for the purposes of this, but it could be obviously whatever your developers have created for you. And then we need the tag, and that's been passed in as that version parameter up top. So we can now just vary that version whenever we need to. So next we need a name for the container. Call that what you want, but it all needs to be lowercase. Let's call it that API. We are going to add some resources. So this is where you can configure it to what size container you want. And this, for us, it's going to be fairly small for the minute because we're doing development. We might want to later change this to be a parameter we pass in so that we can vary it depending on the environment. So we'll look at that later. But for the minute, we are just going to give it half a CPU core and 1 gig of memory. This gives you a warning for some reason. What's complaining about? Yeah, it's expecting an int, but actually it doesn't work because it's not an int, it's a float. If you put it in quotes, it does work. I think they need to sort out the IntelliSense on that one. Okay, and I think that's all we need. Yeah, so we're not passing any additional arguments or environment variables in here. We could if we wanted to, and we don't need them right now. Next up, we're going to use the scale section. This allows us to tell it how many containers we need. And we're going to say, for the moment, we need a minimum rec level of 1. You can do scale to 0 with container apps, and we probably will want to do that eventually. But for the minute, for testing, we're just going to keep it at 1 so that we don't have to deal with that scaling down and as what we're trying to test. Then the next, or the last piece we need is the Dapper section. So if you're not using Dapper with your container, you don't need any of this, but we are. So we need to set up some configuration for Dapper. Now, some of it's fairly straightforward. We're going to enable it. We also need to set the app port, which can be anything as long as it's free. We're going to use 3000, it's a fairly common one. And then an app ID. So every component that you deploy in a Dapper microservices app needs an ID and it needs to be unique. So we're just going to call this the API. It doesn't matter what it is as long as it's unique and you're consistent every time you deploy it. And then the last bit is components. So as I mentioned before, Dapper allows you to configure various different components for use within your application. So state storage, secret storage, PubSub, those sort of things. And it abstracts away a lot of things. So we're going to use CosmosDB as our state storage, but the only thing that knows about it being Cosmos is this components part, and everything else just uses it inside the application as a state store. So we need to give it some information about the component that we're going to use. And this is an array because you can have multiple components. And so we're going to start one here. We're going to call this state store. It's just a reference name. The type is going to be this. This indicates, so this is where it actually defines what, that it's actually Cosmos and not Redis or anything like that. And then the version is just v1. That's the version of the component. And then the metadata is where we need to define the various properties that are needed specifically by CosmosDB. I've already written these out, so we don't have to watch me type, so I'll paste those in and just explain them quickly. So we've got 4 of them here. The first one, we need the URL of the CosmosDB database. So we're just using that account name parameter and then putting the rest of the required URL around it. You probably don't actually need the 443 on the end. You could get away with it, but leave it there. The database name, the collection name, they came from the parameters. And then we've got this master key, which is coming from this CosmosDB key. I have to change the name between testing. So change that there. And that's the actual connection string key that we need for connecting to the database. So what we've got there now defined is a new container app that's going to have a secret for the registry. It's going to connect to our registry we deployed in the previous episode. It's going to be exposed to the outside world. It's going to use this Hello K8 node application. It's going to be minimum 1 replica, and we're going to configure the state store for Dapper. Okay, the last thing we need to do before we can try and deploy it is update our parameter file. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to look at feeding these in from the other file eventually, but at the minute I'm just adding them in here. So I pasted a number of them just straight through, which is just plain old strings. So we've got the container registry name, the username, the version number, and the CosmosDB one. But the one that's probably more interesting is the container registry password. And we're going to pull that from Key Vault. And so the way we can do that, there is actually a property type in property file that will allow us to grab that straight from Key Vault. So I'm just going to paste it in here. And we need a comma. So give it a name. And then we're going to use this reference keyword. This allows us to reference something outside the file. We then pick Key Vault as the reference type, and we give it the ID of the Key Vault, and then the name of the secret that we want to go and have it read. And that will then reach out to Key Vault at the time we deploy, and it will grab that password for us. And that will use the actual ARM Fabric deployment account, which if you remember from the previous video, we ticked that box to allow deployment access. That will now be able to go and read that password. Yeah, so we should be good to go to deploy now. So here we are in the CLI, just going to run that deployment command again. Nothing's changed here. We're just going to run the ACA Bicep file with the dev ACA JSON file, and let's give that a go. So the deployment's finished. That's all got deployed now. However, I did find in my my testing there is a slight issue with our configuration, so we just need to nip back to VS Code and make a quick change. Up here on the Ingress section, the target port, the port the application is actually running on, is port 3000 rather than 80. We changed that, which is why this is set to 3000 down here. So that was my mistake on the previous one. This is not the port Dapper's running on. This is the port Dapper uses to talk to the application, and they need to match. So deployed those and that run that again, and the port's correctly set up now. So over in the portal, we can have a look here, and we can see now we've got our application, the API container deployed. And if we click on that, we can see a bit of information about it. You can actually go in and see the secrets that we created, that container registry password. You can look at the Ingress settings. You can see it's got external Ingress enabled on port 3000 and all those sort of things. You can also come over here and look at this page, overview page, and you can see the application URL. So this gives you the default generated URL for the application. At the moment, container apps don't support vanity URLs that you can put your own on. We will rectify that anyway with App Gateway. However, if we click on that link, it's actually going to time out because at the moment, traffic isn't actually allowed in. You remember we joined this application to the VNet. And if we go have a look at the NSG on the VNet, there are no inbound security rules allowing traffic from on port 443. So we need to go and adjust our NSG setup to add that rule in. So if we head back over to VS Code, and we need to go back to the core infrastructure and have a look at what we set up for our network security group. Now, we didn't actually create any security rules. Remember, we left the default on, which is a fairly good set of rules, but it doesn't allow any inbound traffic. So we need to add in a security rule. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to give it a name, call it allow HTTPS inbound properties, and we want the direction to be inbound. We want access to be allowed. The protocol is going to be TCP. Add a description. And so we need to set a few different things. So we're going to add a source address prefix, and we want to allow traffic from anywhere at the moment. We want the source port range to be anywhere. We want the destination port range to be 443. And we want the destination address prefix to be anywhere at the moment. We might be able to lock that down a bit further to our ACA. I'll have to see about that. We need a priority. Just give it a priority of 200. Needs to be an integer, yeah. And is there anything else we need? Got most of these. Nope. I think that should do it. So we'll go ahead and we will deploy that. So here we go. We can see the rules being created now. And so if we go back to our application and we click on this URL, that loads okay. It's giving us an error because we haven't actually sent a proper request to the API, but it is loading our API. That message has come from our container, which is exactly what we needed. And that is now available for use. If you want to have a look at any more information, you can obviously get the metrics on here. You can also go have a look at the logs, and you can see any log information. We've also got the revision management here, which shows you the different versions of the container that have been deployed, including the one I tested earlier that didn't work. But you can see this one's working. We'll look later when we start looking at our pipelines, how we can use that to be able to provision and send certain level of traffic into the new version while we leave some on the old version to allow for a more seamless transition. So we'll have a look at that in another episode. But that's all we're going to cover today. We've got our container. Our application is finally running in our environment now. So the developers could, if they wanted to, start testing against this environment, which is great. Next week, we're going to take what we've done already and we're going to refactor it. We talked about this quite a lot, is, we want to start off, we want to get things done. Worry too much about making it the most efficient or the simplest approach. Just get it working, get it done. And then next week, we're going to take a look at that. We're going to refactor. We're going to start joining things up. We're going to start having an overarching deployment that will run everything for us. We're going to have a little bit of a look at modules and how we can use that to our benefit. Okay, so we'll cover that next week. Until then, I hope you had a good rest of your day, and hopefully I'll see you then.